Hi, I'm going to read from Becoming by Michelle Obama. I'm going to read several paragraphs from the last chapter, which begins with the first day of Trump's presidency. It's an interesting contrast to the current atmosphere. She wrote this book after her 8 years as First Lady. Barack and I walked out of the White House for the last time on January 20th, 2017, accompanying Donald and Melania Trump to the inauguration ceremony. That day, I was feeling everything all at once: tired, proud, distraught, eager. Mostly though, I was trying just to hold myself together, knowing we had television cameras following our every move. Barack and I were determined to make the transition with grace and dignity, to finish our 8 years with both our ideals and our composure intact. A transition is exactly that, a passage to something new. A hand goes on a Bible, an oath gets repeated, one president's furniture gets carried out while another's comes in. Closets are emptied and refilled. Just like that, there are new heads on new pillows, new temperaments, new dreams. And when your term is up, when you leave the White House on that very last day, you're left in many ways to find yourself all over again. For me, becoming isn't about arriving somewhere or achieving a certain aim. I see it instead as forward motion, a means of evolving, a way to reach continuously toward a better self. The journey doesn't end. I became a mother, but I still have a lot to learn from and give to my children. I became a wife, but I continue to adapt to and be humbled by what it means to truly love and make a life with another person. I have become, by certain measures, a person of power, and yet there are moments still when I feel insecure or unheard. I've been lucky enough to get to walk into stone castles, urban classrooms, and Iowa kitchens, just trying to be myself, just trying to connect. For every door that's been opened to me, I've tried to open my door to others. And here is what I had to say, finally. Let's invite one another in. Maybe then we can begin to fear less, to make fewer wrong assumptions, to let go of the biases and stereotypes that unnecessarily divide us. Maybe we can better embrace the ways we are the same. It's not about being perfect. It's not about where you get yourself in the end. There's power in allowing yourself to be known and heard, in owning your unique story and using your authentic voice. And there's grace in being willing to know and hear others. This, for me, is how we become. That's it.
Thank you, Kathy. A beautiful reading for our time, and really appreciate that. And now I will introduce our speaker. Todd Khozein is the founder and co-CEO of SecondMuse, an impact and innovation company building resilient economies by supporting entrepreneurs and the ecosystems around them. Under his leadership, the company has designed and implemented programs on all 7 continents with over 600 organizations, such as NASA, the World Bank, Nike, USAID, the World Health Organization, and the Rockefeller Foundation. The company is a manifestation of Todd's impassioned belief that economic and social systems can be built inclusively and not at the expense of human dignity or the health of the planet. Todd was born into a Baha'i family in Iran. He fled Iran in his youth as a religious refugee. He is one of the Baha'i leaders of a fantastic Saturday evening discussion group that I often attend, which brings people together of different faiths and backgrounds to talk about how to make a better world. It is my honor to welcome a friend to the screen this morning, Mr. Todd Khozein.
Thanks, Todd, for that wonderful introduction. I suddenly find myself having a deep desire to learn about Korean baseball, even though I grew up in Latin America and we don't really do baseball down there. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. I had an opportunity to learn a little bit on to read your website and learn a little bit, and I got to say I find everything that you have on the website, sort of describing humanist sort of philosophy, so compelling. I mean, there's these ideas of leading ethical lives of personal fulfillment, especially that are not just focused on the individual, but are leading to the service of a greater humanity, is something that I feel like I am. That's my aspiration on a daily basis, and so I find myself particularly drawn to that principle. There was also a principle, I believe, that said something about being guided by reason, inspired by compassion, and informed by experience. And again, I had a similar reaction to these principles, which were something that the world certainly needs today. So what I was planning on doing, maybe if I could have a quick show of hands for those of you that have your cameras up. How many of you have heard about the Baha'i Faith before? How many of you feel like you have a pretty good understanding of the principles of the Baha'i Faith? Okay. All right, great. So what I think I might do is I might just start. I mean, at the end of the day, what I would love to do is to just kind of be useful to all of you. I think that's my goal today, is to help share with you insights, points of view, perspectives that ultimately would be interesting and useful for you all. So what I think I'll do is I'll give a bit more of a broad kind of an overview, and depending on what you want to dig in deeper, I'm happy to dig in deeper to the best of my ability on these different areas. As some of you may know, and as was written in the original introduction, there's no clergy in the Baha'i Faith. So I certainly don't speak from an authoritative sort of perspective. I speak from the perspective of somebody who is a Baha'i, who's been a Baha'i all of their life. And you had originally reached out to the local assembly of Portland, which is our democratically elected sort of leadership body, and they had asked me to come here and sort of share some of my insights. And so I'll do the best that I can to answer any questions that you might have. Certainly nothing is off limits, so feel free to ask me anything sort of as we go along there. So the Baha'i Faith is a faith that began in the middle of the 19th century in Persia, now of course known as Iran. It was born in very much part of the decline of the Persian Empire. The government was very intertwined with a at the time largely fanatical clergy. And the Baha'i Faith represented a fairly significant threat, especially with ideas like the importance of the independent investigation of the truth. One of these principles of the Baha'i Faith is this idea of the sanctity of the individual's investigation of reality. So much so, actually, that proselytizing is forbidden, because there's this idea that to engage in a conversation with another should be part of a quest to find a higher truth. And that ultimately it should not be to try to convert you to an opinion or a belief that I actually have. My understanding of that is there's a fundamental arrogance to try to make you believe something that I believe. It presumes that I have I've cornered knowledge in some way. And so this idea such as this, or ideas such as the equality of men or women, ideas such as the absence of clergy and the elevation of the knowledge of all humans, in a sense that where ministry has not been abolished, ministry has been democratized, right? So we're all our brothers' keepers, we're all our sisters' keepers, in a sense. These ideas were very threatening to a political system that was very dominated by the interests of very powerful clergy. And so right from its earliest days, the Baha'i Faith has kind of was born in the crucible of persecution, from these, from the Persian Empire, and then from the Ottoman Empire, all the way up to actually the Iranian Revolution, where many Baha'is, including my own family, were killed, were kicked out of jobs, sort of because of beliefs that we had. The Baha'i Faith was founded. There's really actually two prophets that are associated with the Baha'i Faith. One is the forerunner of the Baha'i Faith. Kind of think about him like John the Baptist, the forerunner that came, sort of speaking. His name was the Bab. The Bab, B-A-B, stands for gate. In Arabic is what that means. And so he came with his own revelation in Persia, signaling this idea that there was going to be he came with his own sort of teaching and his own faith, and he came proclaiming a much greater religion, which was ultimately a foreshadowing of Baha'u'llah, who is the prophet founder of the Baha'i Faith. Now, the Baha'i conception of religion is that God is this unknowable essence, right? So if God is God, we can't understand him any more than a table would understand his carpenter. So if you think about existence as having some sort of an ontology, where you think about maybe the mineral kingdom having certain attributes and qualities, and then you think about the plant kingdom that incorporates all of the elements of the mineral kingdom, but maybe adds another layer of capabilities. And if you think about the animal kingdom, which adds a layer of capabilities on top of that, we think about kind of like this layer of ontology. And we believe our relationship with God is something that we can never actually understand him, much less describe him. So these anthropomorphic sort of descriptions of God, being this or that, or looking this way or looking that way, is kind of an idea that the Baha'i writings don't subscribe to. Ultimately, God is an unknowable essence. In many ways, this is also related to the concept that I previously mentioned, which is, if this is something that I don't know, then gosh, how can I tell you what or who it is and convince you, when what I should be doing is diving deep into your mind to see what I can learn about this, this unknowable essence that I want to get closer to and I want to understand, where you might understand it in a way that I don't. And so we believe that one of the ways that this unknowable sort of essence, who ultimately loves us, is trying to guide us, is through religion and revelation. And we believe that religion, therefore, is this progressive. It's a progressive and evolutionary reality, where we believe actually in the sanctity and the sovereignty of all the great world religions. We believe that actually they are all from the same God, and they differ not in their fundamental verities or truths, right? I mean, they all speak about the golden rule. They all speak, there's a lot of similarity when you go to the heart of a lot of faiths. But a lot of what they differ in is the relevance for the age in which they came, perhaps, or maybe the emphasis on a certain facet of spiritual reality, for example. If you think about Islam, for example, the concept and the principle of submission is a theme that you see throughout the whole Revelation. When you look at Christianity, the theme of love, for example, is something that you see sort of touch upon. The pivot around very much which the Baha'i faith pivots is this idea of the oneness of mankind, the oneness of humanity. This idea that we truly are one family, that we are, and that ultimately our socio-political and economic systems need to all be rethought and reinvented in reflection of that reality of the oneness of humanity. And so this idea of the evolution of truth, as it were, as from a religious perspective, we thus then believe that that there will be further religions in the future that build upon all the great religions of the past. Now, interestingly enough, one of the things that Baha'u'llah talks about is that there's two books, as it were. One is the book of Revelation, which is, he says that God teaches us and guides us through two books. One is the book of Revelation, and one is the book of Creation, right? So the book of Revelation is look at the legacy of spiritual, doctrine, insights, principles that have come over there, and that's sort of one path by which God helps us grow. The other path is creation, which we access through science. And so this is one of these really fundamental principles of the Baha'i Faith, is the harmony of religion and science. This is a very sort of strong principle, I would say, where the Baha'i writings talk about religion and science being two wings upon which man's intelligence can soar into its heights, and with which the human soul can progress. Going so far as to say that that science without religion will descend into materialism, and possibly amorality, whereas religion without science will descend into superstition. And so this idea of kind of like bringing the ration and the reasonable mind and bring the scientific inquiry that allows us to explore humanity, is not a dissimilar path to the exploration of truth that one might engage in through religious scripture or religious practice, sort of as it were. Now there's this idea also of this evolutionary progress is also an idea that comes out in the Baha'i writings, understanding humanity and the progress of humanity. And so one of the things that the Baha'i Faith really believes, and this kind of like goes to the Baha'i mission, as it were, is this idea that human civilization is progressing and is going through different stages, from our childhood to our adolescence. And we believe that humanity right now is at the stage where it is the time where we go from the kind of like, the rough transition of adolescence into the maturity of adulthood. And specifically what we believe is that humanity is marching towards a path of being a unified human civilization, one that allows all humans to thrive in, and that this is in a sense our mission today. So when we think about how do you, if you accept the premise that there's a loving creator, who we're trying to get close to, yet ultimately it's a futile task because it's almost a Zeno's principle. You're going to get closer and closer and closer, but you're never going to quite sort of get there. This idea that you're going to approach infinity, but you're never going to kind of get there in a sense. That this exists. And that we need each other. We desperately need each other to sort of arrive at these insights. That ultimately the path towards spiritual progress is something that is both internal, where we're trying to be a better person. Actually, I actually feel like this idea of living a life of personal fulfillment that aspires to a greater good of humanity is something that's very much embedded at the core of the Baha'i principles, where I cannot express my love to a loving creator without serving his creation, which is humanity. Therefore, the very purpose of my life has to be an expression of service to humanity. And so, this idea of cloistering myself to achieve holiness is rejected in the Baha'i Faith. The idea that if I actually want to attain spiritual growth in a sense, I need to dedicate my entire life towards service to humanity. And what does that mean? That means recognizing that all of the systems that we have, our political systems, our economic systems, our systems of governance, our systems of how we view each other, all of these need to be rethought because they were all born during a time when we believed in the fundamental superiority of certain humans over other humans for the most asinine reasons, right? Because of, things like ovaries or melanin in your skin. We had these doctrines of superiority of certain humans over other humans. And in many ways, we've built a world based on that. And so one of the things that I think that as Baha'is, we really try to focus on is in our daily lives, our commitment ultimately is towards rebuilding a world in the image of the oneness of humanity. One that has many seats at the table, many voices at the table around sort of around that. One that is constantly questioning. So much so that work, when done in the spirit of service, is elevated to the station of worship in the Baha'i Faith, right? So even the notion of worship is redefined, where worship doesn't necessarily mean cloistering myself in my in my shrine and talking to the Almighty. It means going out there and giving a brother a hand, doing something so that in a spirit of service, and I'm going there. That is actually elevated to sort of the rank of worship, as it will. This also this also means that we're all on this path, and of course, this idea of the independent investigation of the truth is something that carries throughout all of us throughout our lives, because none of us ever get there, right? This is a understanding and developing a deeper understanding, about about all realities requires commitment, but also requires collaborative effort. You know, we need to dive into each other's minds and our souls, as it were, to understand how we each view the world, because that'll give us insights into how we and how we view it. Some of the some of the principles. So those are some of the principles. Maybe I'll sort of stop at that. One of the ways in which the Baha'i Faith organizes itself is through democratic elections at the local, national, and international level. And these are held, annually on a local basis. They're held annually on a national basis, and they're held every 5 years at an international basis. Now, the Baha'i administrative order, though, the relationship with the individual is actually very different. It's not an entity or an organization. While the administrative order legislates in a sense, or is considered the leadership of the community, there's tremendous agency given to the individual to be the ultimate expressor of its spirituality. So what we often see from the international bodies, for example, are frameworks rather than specific mandates. So you generally will not see the administrative order tell somebody do this or do that. Rather, I believe that the reason for that is just the recognition that we each are inspired in different ways. And take us in different directions. And so I think that you just don't want to inhibit that kind of that kind of progress. That said, it's not a free for all, right? I mean, there is like, hey, what do we want to focus on? There are strategies, there are plans, in terms of what the world is focusing on. The group that I'm involved in or the effort that I'm involved in that Todd mentioned early at the top of the call is a topic of conversation called Meaningful Conversations as an example, which we get together at a local level every week and just talk about issues that are relevant for the day of the age. And we're really trying to understand how to build community. That's kind of our mission and our goal. The Baha'i community of Portland is very focused on race relations and racial justice right now within Portland, and they have really bold plans and are really dedicating a tremendous amount of efforts specifically towards that end. Let's understand what the root is of racial inequity, and let's understand what does 4 centuries of oppression actually mean, specifically towards certain people. Let's understand how we can start healing that and how we can start remedying that, because ultimately oppression is not just bad for the oppressed; it dehumanizes the oppressor, and so it's not good for any of us. And this is my work very much is focused on building inclusive economies, right? So my work is very much focused, day in and day out on how do we invest in and build what we call economies of the future, which is, economies that are ultimately, this idea of the negative externality in economic theory. I don't know how many economists there are in the room, but in economic thinking, there's this idea of the negative externality, right? There's this idea that economies need to grow, but it has to come at an expense. And that expense is usually social justice or environmental justice, right? So I have to build my house, but I got to cut down the forest. The forest that got cut down, in effect, would be the negative externality of the development of the house. I would say that taking the Baha'i perspective to my work, I would say, hey, I got to reject this idea that I should consider the negative externality a design flaw. None of us would build families on the back of our children, right? None of us would literally poison the well out of which we're drinking. But we have a tendency to do that in the way that our markets work and in the way our economies actually work. And so I think that this is an example of rethinking and reinventing our social and political and economic systems to be more in line with a greater truth, which is that there's interconnection everywhere, right? You cannot deny the interconnection of economies. You cannot deny the interconnection of the environment in the presence of climate change. You cannot deny the fact that we don't influence each other. It's interesting. There was an article. We were all talking about spending all of our time online earlier online. You know, the Journal of JAMA. What does JAMA stand for? Journal of American Medical Association or something like that. It came out with a really interesting article. I think it was last month, where they compared the levels of depression from 2019 to 2020. You know, where in some age groups you had 3 times the amount of depression from in certain age groups in 2020 than you did in 2019. Now, keep in mind that depression is the world's highest morbidity, meaning it is the largest disease. So you're not talking about just like, you know, small numbers getting tripled. You're talking about the biggest numbers getting tripled. Why is that? It's because we're not hanging out. You know, I mean, you know, we're not. There's something that we're missing, and that's leading to mental illness. You know, in terrifying sort of proportions. And so again, I think that these are principles. You know, this idea that we fundamentally believe in the oneness of humanity, and we need to recognize that when we are not engaged in meaningful relationships, you know, supporting one another, and, you know, in service of building a greater humanity, then there's something really wrong with what we're going to build, and ultimately it's never going to work for the whole. I think that may be a you know, a good place. I might end with a quote from the Baha'i writings that speaks a little bit to what I've been saying, and I'm happy to put some of these in the chat. And then I'd love to see if there's any questions or any particular areas of insight or that you'd be interested in, and then we can delve in there, and we can sort of learn from each other after that. Would love to hear some reactions from this. So the last quote that I'd like to end with is, the call of Baha'u'llah is primarily directed against all forms of provincialism, all insularities and prejudices. If long-cherished ideals and time-honored institutions, if certain social assumptions and religious formulae have ceased to promote the welfare of the generality of mankind, if they no longer minister to the needs of a continually evolving humanity, let them be swept away and relegated to the limbo of obsolescent and forgotten doctrines. Why should these, in a world subject to the immutable law of change and decay, be exempt from the deterioration that must needs overtake every human institution? For legal standards, political and economic theories are solely designed to safeguard the interests of humanity as a whole, and not humanity to be crucified for the preservation of the integrity of any particular law or doctrine. And so I think that this kind of is for me, is one of these quotes that encapsulates this idea that let's not be prisoners to ideas of the past that have long outlived any value they once possessed. And yeah, so yeah, would love to sort of pause there and see if there's questions, thoughts, insights, or reactions. And I'm very happy to go into whether it's the history or whether it's the sort of principles, or whether it's the you know, what the Baha'is are doing today specifically, or anyways. Happy to be challenged as well.
Okay, Todd, you have inspired many questions. Thank you for the presentation and drawing the parallels between the Baha'i and humanists. And our first question comes from someone on our technical production team, Mr. Jeff Strang.
Thank you, Todd. And Todd, nice overview of the Baha'i religion or faith or philosophy. I'm curious about revelation in raising children. Do parents suggest ways to for the children to seek revelation? How do people get an orientation on seeking revelation in the Baha'i philosophy?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That's a wonderful question. So Baha'u'llah wrote over 100 volumes. I mean, there's extensive Baha'i writings that talk about a whole variety of different issues. I'll say a couple things about parenting in particular. There's there's this interesting idea about an age of maturity, which is a concept in the Baha'i Faith, which is this age of kind of 15. And this age of maturity is sort of when we're all expected, as I grew up as a Baha'i child from sort of 0 to 15. And there was a moment when I was encouraged to make my own choice, right? So there's this really interesting balance between parents both providing an essential framework and essential education and training for children and ideas in terms of how to meet the world, and also allowing for the emergence of a child to bring their own amazing into the world that might be different or better or whatever than the frameworks that I think that we have provided sort of our children. And so one of the activities that Baha'is engage in are in children's classes, right, where we have classes that really focus on the values and the virtues and the reason why these values and virtues are so important in integrating into our lives. Now I think that there's also, I think that parenting is evolutionary, right? I mean, you're a parent when your child is 1 and you're a parent when your child is 40, and there's very different needs about what that means. At the age of 40, it's probably much more of a conversation and an exploration. And at the age of 1, it's probably much more of a teaching the value of particular virtues or frameworks. But there is the role of the parent in the Baha'i Faith as the primary provider of those early spiritual frameworks, which ultimately are moral frameworks, in which to sort of live your life, are quite essential. I'm happy to point you to different resources that in the Baha'i Faith, if that's what you're interested in. I'm sorry, Jeff, did I actually answer what your question actually was, or did I babble on about something else?
Yeah, that was good.
Thank you. And our next question comes from Hank.
So is there a notion of some life after this one? And what's the relationship of what happens here to that life, if there is a life after this one?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Hank. So ultimately, the Baha'is believe that our actual reality is the soul, right? And what is the soul? I mean, you tell me. But it's some kind. It's the physical world and the world in which we exist right now is a very, very temporary but very important world as we sort of see it, right? So we believe that our true essence and our true reality is that of a soul taking a hitching a ride on a physical body. Now, the reason why this world we believe is so important is because this world is one in which the decisions that we make and the decisions that we don't make directly influence the growth of that soul. So there's this wonderful analogy in the Baha'i writings that compare the soul in this world to a child in the womb of a mother. Where the child in the womb of a mother is growing hands, but there's nothing to grasp, is growing eyes, but there's nothing to see, is growing, has a nose, but there's nothing necessarily to smell. Ears, we do know that children actually can listen, so I won't that won't be the best of analogies. But we're building capabilities that ultimately are not designed for thriving in the world of the womb. Ultimately, they're designed for thriving in the world in which you're going to be born into. And in many ways, we view the soul as the same. So that decisions that we make in this world, do we do the right things? Do we live? Do we act in accordance? Do we do the noble thing? Do we learn how to love deeper? Do we take the harder but the righter path? Do we make the decisions that are ultimately the correct decisions? Do we treat people with dignity? Do we the way that we live our life, certain actions that we do, strengthen capabilities of our soul that ultimately are less designed for this world and are more designed to the eternal progress of the soul. Even so much that the idea of hell and heaven is presented very differently in the Baha'i Faith. Hell is we see it as the fire of regret of a decision that you can't take back, more so than a place. Whereas heaven is so if you think about this eternal unknowable essence that we call God. The idea of progress is the soul's continuous progress closer and closer towards its beloved. This is a theme that is repeatedly addressed through Persian poetry, right? This idea of the lover chasing the beloved. The stories of what are called Layli or Majnun, they almost read like a Romeo and Juliet in Arabic and Persian poetry, but it's not about the love between a man and a woman. It's a love between a human and the divine, where the woman is always the depiction of the divine. And there's this idea that you're always trying to come closer to your beloved. And so this idea of the journey and the progress of the soul is one of continuously getting closer to your true beloved, to your ultimate beloved. And that the soul may pass through many different phases, and this world is kind of like the first world, where it's like where we get to strengthen our soul, and ultimately we will continue to live beyond. But that choices matter, and choices have consequence, and so we can choose to develop that soul and those attributes and capabilities or not, and that ultimately will determine, our joy and our happiness, sort of in the next world.
Good question so far, and one of the humanists known for tough questions is the humanist with an ironic name, Mr. Al Christians.
Okay, here we go. Hard question. The religions I'm most familiar with are humanism and Unitarianism, which I would classify as dull religions. And I'm basically a dull person. And I find your presentation very dull, and I love it. It's just great. But the real interesting religions have one thing in common, and there are lots of new religions that do this and lots of old religions that do this, which is that they all redefine human sexuality, basically in consistent ways with the sexual preferences and phobias of their founders. And I wonder if you're just concealing this part about your religion, or if your religion is really a dull religion. Was it sexually radical in some way when it started, but it's dull now? Or does it believe in monogamy? Does it believe in marriage? Does it believe in do your own thing? Does it believe in whatever? Tell us about what it's doing there, because this is what really drives the growth of some of these groups. You can look at them, the Mormons and the Muslims and the Catholics, and it's such an essential part of a religion that's really going to be big time. Tell us about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really good religion. And I think by your classification, the Baha'i Faith would continue to be a dull, or I don't know.
He doesn't mean dull. It's just.
Do you apologize for your husband frequently, Helen? I appreciate the question. So I think that this is actually an interesting question. I mean, drawing from the conversation that we just have. I mean, we have a hypersexual world, right? So much is defined by sexuality. Identity is defined by sexuality. Purpose is sometimes defined by sexuality. And I think that sexuality is something that is very limited to this world. I mean, if we believe, for example, that so the Baha'i premise is that the soul has no gender, right? The soul has no race. The soul has therefore, this idea of sexuality is something that is I don't know. It is overemphasized in a hypersexual world in which we agree, where everything from advertising to philosophies bring something, and possibly one of the reasons is because it's been repressed for so long that we're having this explosion of it's the most important thing in the world. So I think overall, the importance of sexuality in the progress of the human soul is something that is minimized, right? Sex is beautiful when happening within the confines of a monogamous marital relationship, is the Baha'i view, right? This. Now, I will say something else though, is that should anybody choose to not live within the precepts of the Baha'i Faith, and a monogamous marital relationship is defined as a heterosexual relationship in the Baha'i Faith. Now, I would say that take this idea that, so I think take that as whatever it is. Then I think take the other idea is, how do Baha'is perceive of others living their way in a different life, in a different way based on different rules? And is there a sense of my superiority based on a perception of living my life that my own mental model and my own faith tells me is the right way to live? This does not give me 1 ounce of a feeling of superiority, betterness, or more rightness than anybody else that chooses to live their life differently. And I think that this is possibly the key, right? I think that that the Baha'i Faith subscribes to a certain set of, yes, there's practices, right? Baha'is don't drink alcohol, Baha'is don't drink, I mean, I think that there's certain restrictions over there, but the restrictions are such a minor part of the purpose of the revelation, limited to not only this world, within the context of this world, but also limited to, our belief about building a new world that represents this is not limited to interaction with other Baha'is. As a matter of fact, it's specifically mandated to not. I mean, this idea, if one of the wonderful comments and notions that Baha'u'llah brings is that if religion is the cause of disunity, it's better to have no religion at all. Like, what's the point of religion if it's just if the whole purpose of human civilization is to be unified, and religion ends up disunifying us, then why even have it at all? Is one of the points in the comments that we make. So I don't know if that answer was satisfactory to.
Thank you.
We'll have a question from Helen a bit later, but we'll take the questions in order. And we'll go to a question from Lewis.
Hello. I think Hank pretty much asked my question. I was concerned about, heaven or hell kind of thing. And from your answer, maybe a little clarity. So is like maybe reincarnation part of that? I understood your response as that, hell would be, a terrible regret thing, and heaven might be an acceptance thing because you never can comprehend God. And so are we going to reincarnate, or, was there a place before and we're passing through and we're going to continue to work on that post-death?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I would say that I think the answer is yes and no from a reincarnation standpoint. I mean, we believe that this is the first place that the soul hitches a ride in the world, right? So we believe that the soul is born, and enters the body in this world. In a sense, death can be conceived of and framed as a reincarnation, right? Because it's a new life. We don't believe that you come back to this world, because we believe that I think that if you think about, for example, I mean, we believe that we will continue to live in new forms, not dissimilar to when the carcass of a dead animal will regain life in the form of a plant that will then be eaten in an animal that will then kind of like find new forms. But I think that what we believe is that there's a progressive and evolutionary elements to the development of the soul. And so we won't just come back to the same place, but we're going to go into a better place. And what we're seeing in the Baha'i writings is in the same way that, the womb is amazing and it's warm and it's nice and it's a great place to be. But then you come into this world and you're like, oh my God, this is so much better than the limited version of reality that I actually thought that it was. And so we believe that as we die and as we go into, the next world, whatever that world may be, that's going to be a similar relationship where it's going to be infinitely more rich than what this world other is. So we believe that it's a progress rather than a rinse, wash, and repeat.
Okay, so we're all virgin souls, and then we go on to something else.
We're all virgin souls, and we go on to something else.
Okay, thank you.
I like that statement that death can be considered a reincarnation. It's an interesting thought, because I think the question is, for some humanists and atheists, the death is a reincarnation of nothing, and for others, it's a journey to other things. So I like that. Question from Dave Danucci.
I'm trying to make some of this fit. And so first of all, the way you started describing it, it sounded very much like a God of the gaps argument. That is, God is the stuff that we don't understand, that we'll never understand, etc. And that's almost the definition of God, it sounds like, in the Baha'i system. and yet there's this, I think you used the term, there's this attempt to get closer and closer, but we'll never get there. And so that's kind of interesting to me too, that it's defined as this thing we'll never get to, but yet we try to get to it, etc. But also I'm interested in this idea that Baha'i teaches these various things as the best way or whatever, but yet, but we don't want to impose that on other people. My view often of Christianity is, we see these evangelists as very troublesome. They're trying to get into our lives or whatever, but their explanation is, I'm just trying to save you. I'm trying to, make things better for you. And, this is a gift from me to you that I'm trying to save your soul, etc. So I do still kind of wonder how that fits in. And maybe specifically, I didn't hear the term pro-life or abortion anywhere. And I'm kind of wondering what the feeling is about that. And I can maybe build something up based on your description of souls or something, but I'm sure you can tell us better. And in that context, I noticed in the news this morning, I think it was one of the candidates for Senator, Warnock, who's a minister, has said that he's pro-life, and now his church says you can't be pro-life, and in our church, you're really screwing things up. That's just an aside, sort of, but I'd like to hear what you think about these.
Yeah, totally. So there was, I think there were three sort of questions in there. So the first one about the God of the gaps. I mean, not really. There sometimes God is kind of like an excuse for stuff that we don't yet understand, right? And I think that that's like definitively not. We believe that we should push the boundaries of science and understanding as much as we can. And sometimes we just don't know something yet, and we will understand it. I think that you need to hold that at the same time that you're holding this idea of, is there something that is fundamentally an ontologically different reality that we are ultimately going to be limited towards understanding? Now, there's a paradox there, right? Because like the whole purpose of your life should be trying to understand that which is ultimately not understandable. And there's definitely a paradox at best, a contradiction at worst in saying that. However, I think that we can understand more and more and more and more and more, even if you accept the fact that you'll never fully understand something. And I think that defines our mandate in terms of spiritual growth, is getting closer to an understanding more of, which means be relentless in your pursuit of knowledge. Even recognizing that you might understand. Are we ever going to understand the mysteries of the universe? We have tried to say that in the past, but we never are going to understand it. If not, is science going to end? Science is never going to end. Science is always going to have a deeper mystery and a deeper mystery and a deeper mystery and a deeper mystery. So sometimes I think that there was an error where the church took a position of we know everything. And this is like a middle-aged perspective. And because the church has to be infallible, the church has to make pronouncements on reality, and anything that's wrong is a threat to the church's infallibility, or to papal infallibility. Therefore, they inadvertently placed themselves on the opposite side of science, and many brilliant minds were killed as a result of that. Now, that's tragic, right? Because at the end of the day, show me a scientist that thinks that we're going to open the last book of science. We thought that we did it when we, discovered the atom, but we didn't, and there's always going to be deeper. So I don't know if it's that different. So when I think about myself as a scientist and thinking about how I'm always exploring I'm never going to get there because there's always a layer deeper that we're going to understand. I mean, it's almost like, I don't know if we're ever going to get there. So I think that that's kind of the example, right? Where it's almost like you want to understand reality and understanding truth, but you got to realize that it is so deep that you're just going to keep going and going and going and going and going. And you can't ever expect to arrive and know everything. Because there's always going to be sort of a deeper mystery. So I think that's how I respond to that. The other thing around saving, I think that a lot of evangelical efforts are done in the sincerest of motives because it's, hey, I love you and I care about your soul and I see something that's good for you and I'm going to give it. I mean, as a parent, your child might not want healthy food and you're giving it to them even despite that they don't want it because it's right? I mean, there's a logic to that framework of thinking. I mean, hell, that's what drove the Crusades, right? I mean, at some level, somebody thought that, going around and killing and raping and pillaging was an expression of God's love, but it totally wasn't, right? I mean, it was really bad, in retrospect. And I'm not comparing evangelizing to the Crusades. What I'm just saying is that sometimes there's a wonderful framework. I mean, look at inadvertent acts of racism that all of us on this call have engaged in. Right? I mean, there's something about an intention which is different from action. Right? Where it's like, you may have the best of intentions, but you need to go deeper into your intentions to understand whether your action is actually having the intended outcome that you actually want it to have. And so by me saying, hey, I want all of you to become Baha'is, and I'm going to say whatever I can say to convince you to become a Baha'i, like, I'm not entering into this conversation from a position of humility. I'm not entering into this conversation with a perception of caring about you all. And you've spent lifetimes. I grew up in Latin America. I'm a medical doctor. I did economics. I'm a man in a man's world. I mean, these all represent either biases, limitations, or opportunities for insights that I share. And I know every single person on this call, I'm a cis man that looks white, even though I grew up in a religiously oppressed, intergenerational, trauma kind of a situation. That means that I bring something unique to this world, but it also means that I'm limited in terms of what I bring. And so I think that the saving piece is I have to engage in these conversations with you all, right? Because I want to get closer to the truth and I desperately want you to get closer to the truth. But that's different than me saying, my framework and belief of truth is what you need to believe, because that presumes that I actually know truth. And that's where the flaw is, because there's flaws in the way that I think about the world. There's millions of flaws in the way that I'm going to do it. And the only way I'm going to start to discover an unknowing truth, whether the Baha'i faith is right or wrong, whether it's true or not, at the end of the day, the premise that the Baha'i faith gives me is that, hey, if God is unknowable and God's approach to teaching us and guiding us is revelation, then revelation is deep too. I mean, even if I bring you a Baha'i quote, I can't tell you definitively this is what this quote means, even though I've been a Baha'i all my life. And this will be the first time you see about the Baha'i faith, because I need to have the humility to be able to welcome your alternate view of what this is. And I may have had I've had this happen all the time, where friends of mine who are not Baha'is, I share a quote or teaching, and they're like, no, this is actually, I see it totally differently. And it actually advances my understanding. So I think that that's where the saving is different from the engaging in sincere, authentic dialogue for the purpose of discovering an elusive truth, which is that's how I would sort of circle that square. I don't know if that's helpful, David. The last question that you asked me was around abortion. I mean, the Baha'i belief is that the soul enters the body at conception. Now, this principle is what many churches why it places them sort of anti-abortion in a sense. The challenge with the abortion conversation is that it comes from women's rights are important versus don't kill. Nobody has the rights to kill another being, right? That's why there's this conversation is sort of like this. Do I believe that women have the sanctity of their bodies? Of course. Do I believe in the equality of men and women? 100%. Do I believe that you can't tell somebody else what to do? Of course. Like I've just spent the whole presentation doing it. So I think that do I think that there's circumstances that make this particularly difficult to do when you look at a child that may have severe, mental, physical issues, a mother that is not in an ability to be able to raise a child, a child that is born out of a, unwilling consensual relationship. I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons that complicates this question, which I think are very valid topics to sort of really explore and sort of discuss. The belief is that the soul enters the body, has to come at a certain point. The Baha'i belief is that it's a conception. So I think that there's actually both elements of both sides of the argument that actually I would strongly advocate for.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Our next question is from Joyce.
Todd, thank you so much. My first introduction to Baha'i was, it might have been 40 years ago. I don't remember when I first started reading about it, but one of the, and I did read some Baha'u'llah, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but one of the concepts that just really stuck with me, and in a sense is almost defined Baha'i for me, was that the faith encouraged racial intermarriage as part of this goal toward human unity or humanity's oneness. It almost seemed like a basic principle to me. Is that sort of exaggerating its importance?
No, I mean, I don't think it is. I mean, ultimately, if we don't believe that the soul has a gender or a race, then the idea of like dividing ourselves based on the color of our skin is as dumb as it sounds. And so ultimately, what the Baha'i Faith believes that until, I mean, what was the analysis that the New York Times did about there being more CEOs in the Fortune 500 with the first name John than there are women CEOs? I mean, that's a travesty. If you look at kind of like, the amount of women that are on different, that are leaders of the world, I mean, we're celebrating the first woman VP that we're having in this country, but there's like 90 other countries on the planet that have elected a head of state as a woman. I mean, like we're not that far out. But in the same thing, race is a tremendous. We view race, I think, in the Baha'i writings explicitly talk about that. Racism being, in a sense, kind of like the original sin of the United States. I mean, this being kind of like it's described as the most challenging issue. So the Baha'i writings talk specifically about the America's most challenging issue being race and racism. Now, you can find the roots of racism and colonialism, and so like you can see so this idea that we need to abolish. I mean, I don't care. I mean, there's this basic principle, right? I don't care who you are. I don't care what your sexuality is or your preferences. I don't care what your race is. I don't care what your gender is. At the end of the day, we're all human souls. And at the end of the day, there's certain things that we're really good at and there's certain things that we're really bad at, and we're trying to progress. And that defines and dominates the Baha'i perception of other individuals. Now, areas where there's particularly been a legacy of prejudice, we're encouraged to tackle it in particularly strongly. And I think that that's when you see interracial marriage being highly recommended and suggested, and explicitly so, as a way, in a sense, of dismantling, some of these weird, crazy sort of divides that we've engaged in sort of as humans.
Our next question is from Harsh.
Hi, Todd. Al called your religion boring. From what I understood, your religion is, to me, one of the most tolerant religions. But when I review the history of religions, it is the intolerant religions that have grown. More intolerant a religion, faster it grows. And without naming any religion, that tells us a little bit about the humanity. Now, my question is, what do you see the future of Baha'i Faith? And you don't even promote it very much. So how do you think humanity should get to know it more?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, it's not dissimilar to the conversation that you all had this morning, from what I understand. I think, so I think a couple things, right? I mean, I think that we all need to bring it, right? Every single one of us needs to bring it, right? Which means that Baha'is need to bring it as well. Hey, we have these insights, right? I mean, Baha'u'llah talked about, the elimination of racial prejudice and the equality of genders and the need for international collaboration in the middle of the 19th century, right? And we need to say, hey, this is why it's important and relevant today. I think one of the areas where the Baha'i Faith, for example, is particularly spending a lot of energy right now is on race relations, in particular in the United States. I mean, it's a huge area of focus for Baha'i communities sort of around the world, but in particular in the United States. I think that the Baha'is more and more need to be having conversations and engaged in the biggest issues of today, because we actually have really strong opinions about political systems, right? One of the things that Baha'is talk about is that the flaw of a partisan political system, for example, specifically because we split our country into two parties and then we're shocked when we're disunified, And so there's an opinion about, hey, don't build a political system that is not designed to unify a country or designed for open dialogue. I think that the Baha'is have this concept of consultation, for example, which is a form of decision-making, which I think is highly relevant. Where, if we're trying to come up with an answer, it's never about convincing somebody else to your side. As a matter of fact, as soon as the word leaves my mouth, I no longer own it. And actually the local assemblies, what they're supposed to be doing is that we're supposed to be mandated by this principle of how they engage in dialogue. And so if I think about how does the Baha'i Faith influence the world, I think that we need to actively collaborate, actively work with other organizations all around the world to try to understand how to build ultimately a better world that we have opinions on, and that we need to also be less shy about bringing our sort of opinions sort of to the table. But ultimately, I don't think that the concept of the Baha'i Faith is that the Baha'is are going to save the world, right? I mean, I think that the Baha'is are like, hey, there's this really rich framework that we have that can influence the direction of the world. And it's our responsibility to dedicate our entire lives towards building this a more beautiful world. But it's not going to be, I don't see it being something that it's like, that they're going to be crafting it. It's more going to be like in partnership and in dialogue with many other groups that come at the world from many other perspectives. Certainly locally, that's the approach that the local Baha'i community is taking, figuring out how to work with other organizations to address the most important challenges and problems of the day. I think that the most interesting efforts in the Baha'i community are the ones where they are actively engaged in trying to solve a problem that is an issue of the age, be it climate change, be it racism, be it sexism, rather than just reading a scriptural. I totally agree with your comment about the intolerance versus the tolerance, by the way. I mean, when you create an enemy, you create a burning platform to rally people around there. I just think that would be in such opposition to the Baha'i Faith that I think that we need to learn about ways to be, all of us, to be relevant without making an enemy and without actually inadvertently oppressing one segment of the population to help the rest. I hope that was a reasonable answer, Harsh.
Our next question is from Helen.
Part of our organization is we're doing building a trust group and trying to find an organization or people that are different than us that we can meet with. And so I'm really interested in the work that the Baha'is are doing on racial equality, because we're finding it almost impossible to meet with folks. I think I had all these assumptions that everybody has Zoom and everybody has broadband and everybody's like me. And I'm really getting some eye openers that people aren't like me, don't have the privileges that I have. So I'm very interested in what you're doing, your group.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question, Helen. And I know that I mean, there's not a lot of time between Erica Garner and George Floyd, but there is a dramatic difference in a perception of where Erica Garner, the majority of Americans felt that it was a bad apple problem, whereas George Floyd, the majority of Americans are now recognizing that it's actually a systemic problem, and that systemic racism has had a way of seeping its way into laws, our political frameworks, into our economy, and it's clearly an issue of the time. I would definitely encourage you, and I'm happy to connect you, both the LSAs of Portland as well as the LSAs of Lake Oswego, LSA being a local spiritual assembly, meaning that's the democratically elected local group that I was doing. So both the Portland Baha'i community as well as the Lake Oswego Baha'i community have a number of efforts and activities. I mean, I know that in the Portland Baha'i Center, they've been gathering, from what I understand, about 100 people or so have been gathering on a weekly basis to talk about specifically race issue, and I think that both organizations would be highly interested in some kind of a collaborative relationship. I know that the Lake Oswego community is also involved in a lot of activities around healing racism. I'm trying to remember what the name of it is. Anyways, I'm very happy to connect you with both of those, with both of those assemblies, who I know would be really receptive to have a conversation and possibly more.
Kathy Hummel has a couple of short questions, which I'll summarize. The first is, how many Baha'i members are there worldwide? And the second is, how important is I think you kind of answered this, but you can speak more to it. How important is the Messiah to the Baha'i faith?
Yeah, so around six or so million Baha'is around the world. The Encyclopedia Britannica in the I don't know what it was, 80s or 90s, famously sort of said that it was the Baha'i faith was the second most widespread religion, sort of after Christianity. So despite its reasonably small numbers, it's pretty widespread. And you can imagine the Baha'i faith and its expression as a community looks different. If you're in Cambodia, or if you're in Nigeria or Mongolia or Ecuador, where I grew up, or in different places of the United States. In terms of the Messiah, do you mean like the prophet, the prophet founder? How important is the prophets to the?
Yeah, I think that.
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, one of the reasons why I think that the oppression of the Baha'i faith was so severe in the United States is that in the middle of the 19th century, there was this tremendous global messianic expectation. I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of ministers and churches that had the expectation of the return, from multiple faiths. I mean, you had the Millerites, which of course were the precursor of the Seventh-day Adventists, who actually anticipated that in 1844, which happens to be the exact year that the Bab revealed his message that Christ would return. You had similar expectations in Islam, in particular in Shia Islam. The difference between Sunni and Shia Islam is that on Muhammad's deathbed, the Sunnis believe that his successor was Ali, who was his son-in-law, whereas the Sunni believe that the leadership of Islam then went to the Caliphate, which had its seat in Constantinople. The Shia religion then had a series of imams, which were kind of like leaders of Islam that went down. And the last imam kind of went into a cave and said, "When I come back, it's going to be the time of the great return, and blood is going to flow through the streets," and a whole bunch of other stuff. Anyways, kind of their version of like the return of Christ. And so whether it's the Zoroastrians, whether it was a lot of Christian groups, or further, there was this kind of spirit of messianic expectations. The Baha'is do believe that that Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i Faith, is the promised return of all of these great spiritual teachers that promise to return. Every single one of them promised to return, and we believe that this is just the way that God rolls. You know what I mean? Like, where it's like, you're always going to have another prophet. Like, these prophets do return, because that's the book of Revelation that I was talking about at the beginning. And so we do believe that Baha'u'llah is the latest in the succession of prophets, which, you can call the return, but you can also call it the natural sort of evolution of religious history, as it were. So in that case, very important. I mean, Baha'u'llah, who is the prophet founder of the Baha'i Faith, has a whole body of writings, right? He wrote 100 volumes of writing, much with his own hand. So we have the authenticated original versions of all of his writings. His son, whose name was Abdul Baha, which means, so Baha'u'llah means glory of God, is the Arabic translation. Then he wrote a will and a testament, in his own hand, saying the next person that's going to be in charge of the religion is going to be my son, whose name was Abdul Baha. He wrote a will and testament who said the next person that's going to be in charge of the faith is going to be a dual successorship, which was his grandson as well as the administrative order. So right now, the sole and legitimate, so there's only one Baha'i Faith in a sense, right? Because this has been documented, extensively and written around there. However, none of us have the right of interpretation, right? So it doesn't matter how smart I think I am or how long I've been a Baha'i, I cannot tell anybody else what this means in terms of the original Baha'i writings. So we believe that it's that we associate the revealed word with a North Star in terms of reality, but there's also a huge, there's a hole you could drive a truck through in terms of how you can interpret different things. But the absence of having authorized interpreters, right? So like anything that I'm telling you can be challenged, right? Because at the end of the day, I have my ideas, but irrespective of how, clever I find myself to be, I have blind spots, and so therefore they're there. So we put immense effort still in the original scripture as a sense. It's something that we sort of try to read on a daily basis and sort of bend our characters to.
I think I will ask the next question because Todd, I know you're a very humble guy, and I think the work that you're doing at SecondMuse is quite impressive, very humanistic, as well as in line with the Baha'i Faith. Whenever someone says they do work on 7 continents, my mind immediately goes to Antarctica. So I'll ask the question this way: what kind of work is the SecondMuse doing in Antarctica?
It's actually more than 7 continents, because we've also been working closely with astronauts on the International Space Station.
Cool.
A lot. There actually was a NASA outpost that we were working with. We work really closely with NASA, specifically taking NASA's data, which has traditionally been fairly inaccessible, to help innovators around the world, really come up with new technologies and new solutions using NASA's data. This is really exciting because, while half of NASA's satellites are looking at stars, the others are looking at the planet. And so we have this enormous body of knowledge about our planet that's growing, but NASA has limited resources. There's only so many people that live in there, and we will never have the mind of a 12-year-old girl from Ulaanbaatar influence the direction of what we can do with this data. And so what we do is something called the International Space Apps Challenge, where we engage tens of thousands of people around the world to build technological solutions to some of the world's big problems using NASA's data. And that was one of the things that we did in Antarctica. Yeah. So Pete says. So Pete challenges me. He says, "You say you can't know God. Yet you then profess beliefs about God's intentions for us. If you can't understand God, how can you know there is one and what her purposes are? Many of the traits you've described, which I think are admirable, don't need a God to implement. That, of course, is why I'm in agreement with your humanitarian ideals, but I prefer humanism." Yeah, I think that's great. I think those are great comments, sort of Pete. I think that, at the end of the day, we all have frameworks for how we advance in knowledge and truth, right? There is and a lot of those frameworks are statements of belief, right? One of the fundamental elements of science, which defines science, is an articulation of faith. And this is the funny thing about science, right? Science starts with the presumption that we can understand a mysterious reality. That's an articulation of faith, because we have repeatedly been wrong in scientific exploration. And we have if any of you, we were speaking about physics, and I think that there's a few physicists in the room. Physics makes a lot of sense until you start learning about quantum. And then you realize that everything that you learned was actually probably wrong. And so I think that there's a premise that we have, which is that God is, and that he educates us through a series of prophets, which we believe that have a a unique access to an almighty divine. And this is a belief, right? It could certainly be wrong, I mean, it could certainly be that there's, that purpose doesn't exist. It could certainly be that we're an anomaly and an accident. It could certainly be, I mean, there's lots of scientific theories that provide different frameworks for how we explore reality. But at the end of the day, I could turn it around and say, why humanism? Why do we need to behave well? Who says we need to be good? Who can, I mean, I think that, and the fact is that you believe that there's a framework for a reason for being good and a reason for noble behavior. And I think that once we have those frameworks, we need to challenge our frameworks. And I think that that's why I really appreciate your question, right? Like, challenge it. Like, why do you believe what you believe? Are there discrepancies in what I believe? And I love it when somebody points out a discrepancy in my belief, because it causes me to think a little bit deeper. And sometimes those frameworks that we have break, and we're like, oh my gosh, the framework that I had for my container for everything is getting challenged, and I need to rethink the whole framework. But it's really useful to have a framework to progress. I find, right? Whatever that container framework is. And so, I'd say that the broad Baha'i framework is that God is, and he speaks to us through creation and through revelation. And therefore, we view revelation as kind of like this, I believe that there is a God because that's what the prophets say. And that's what my investigation in science has suggested to me. Now, do you need faith to be good? No, I don't think so. I mean, but you need something. I mean, you need some reason to be good instead of bad. You need some reason to drive your actions. And so I think that otherwise we descend into a postmodernist where anything goes. And the problem with what anything goes is that some things create incredible suffering. If anybody can do whatever they want as long as they believe that it's right, well, if I believe that, tragic things are right, if I believe that slavery is right, if I believe that emitting enormous greenhouse gases are right, well, it's going to cause tremendous suffering to others. And so I think it's a robust and interesting. Anyways, this is a much longer question than I think that what we have tonight. But I really appreciate you bringing it up, Pete. I mean, I think that these are incredibly important questions that we all need to be asking ourselves.
Well, Todd, thank you again today. This is a presentation that meant a lot to me for several reasons. I've been a part of both the Saturday night group of the Baha'i for a couple of years now, and obviously part of the humanists for many, many years. And I've been saying to our membership that there's a lot of crossover between the two philosophies and outlooks, and hopefully some of the members see that as well today.